In this video, I'm going to be performing a CPU upgrade on this Apple PowerMac G4 mirror drive door model. Now, this is the base and oldest model of the PowerMac G4 MDD. It is the dual 867 MHz version of the machine, as you can see right there. Now, this model was the first model ever released, and it has a 133 MHz bus speed. I have 2 GB of system memory installed, and the stock PowerPC 7455 CPU has a level 2 cache of 256K and a level 3 cache of 1 MB. Now the goal in this video is to replace this PowerPC CPU, this MC7455 CPU, with a Motorola or Freescale MC7457 CPU instead. Now, the 7457 is just a newer version, basically, of the 7455 that's used in these machines, and in theory, it should just be a drop-in replacement for the most part. So I've got my box of CPUs right here. This is just all 745 or 7448 CPUs and 7457s, as you can see right there. I do have quite a few of them. So we should be able to use them no problem. So we're just going to go ahead and solder a couple of these onto my 867 MHz CPU card, patch the system firmware accordingly, and overclock this processor, assuming this works at all. From what I understand, this hasn't been tried before, and so this will be just an experiment, if nothing else. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and run a Geekbench on this machine with the stock 867 MHz MC7455 CPUs, and we'll get a baseline reading of the system performance. And then from there, we're going to go ahead and replace the CPUs with these 7457s, which, by the way, are rated at 1.25 gigahertz. And then we'll overclock those a little bit to see how much performance we can squeak out of them. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and start running the benchmarks here, and once that completes, I will go ahead and resume the video and show you the results. Alrighty, as you can see here, the Geekbench has completed successfully, and you can see we have achieved a score of 767. So definitely not all that great, especially for a dual CPU machine. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is save this result just to the desktop as, let's see, MDD 7455, just so we have that to compare to once we've completed the upgrade. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and quit out of Geekbench. Now, the first thing we need to do before we start making any hardware modifications to the system is we need to apply a firmware patch to the machine's system ROM. And the way we're going to do that is using a GigaDesign's firmware updating tool that I've found, and it will add support to the system's boot ROM for 7457 CPUs. Now, I'm not really sure if this tool works in Leopard. I recall that I've tried this once before and it didn't work. So if it doesn't work in Leopard now, I'm going to go ahead and boot this machine up off of another machine's hard disk through target disk mode that has a copy of Tiger on it, and then install the firmware update from there. But let's go ahead and give it a try in Leopard first, since it's the only copy of macOS I have installed on this machine. So what we're going to do here is just select Install Firmware Update right there, and just select Shut Down. Now, once that's shut down, what we want to do is boot the machine in firmware programming mode. So the way we're going to do that, I believe on this machine, and it might be different, I might have to look this up, but I believe all you have to do is hold down the power button until it starts flashing. So let's go ahead and give that a try. Alright, and it seems to have booted in firmware programming mode, so let's see what happens. And the fans are running at full speed. They've quieted down, it seems. Alright, it actually worked from Leopard. I didn't realize that would. So as you can see there, it says install firmware update was successful, and it is now possible for you to install your upgrade. So yeah, we'll go ahead and wait for that to reboot, and then we'll begin taking the CPU card out of the machine. Alrighty, so as you can see here, I've gotten the CPU card out of the machine, and before we actually replace the processors on this thing, the first thing we need to do is change the CPU V-core voltage. Now, according to the datasheet for the 7457s that I'm going to be using, the CPU core voltage should be set to 1.3 volts. Now, as for these processors, these 7455s running at 867 megahertz, they have a core voltage set right now to 1.85 volts. So definitely quite a bit more than is needed for the 7457s, and leaving it at that voltage would probably blow the 7457s up, or at least fry them in some way and make them not functional any longer. So the first thing we need to do is actually change the CPU V-core voltage. Now the way you do that is by changing some resistors on or right next to this chip right here, which is the voltage regulator for the CPU V-core voltage. So thanks to a guide by Jay Vry of the House of Moth, we can actually determine what resistors need to be set to achieve a certain V-core voltage. Now, as you can see here, this is the current configuration of my CPU card, and according to this diagram, that should give us 1.85 volts, as I mentioned. So if we take a look here, you can see, get my tweezers out here, it'll probably be easier to see. You can see these two resistors are populated, this one is not populated, and then this resistor and this resistor are populated. So as you can see, that does indeed match the diagram here. You can see the populated resistors there, and like I said, that is 1.85 volts. So what we need to do is decrease that to 1.3 volts. Now, according to that same diagram, we can go to this image right here for 1.3 volts. And according to that, we just have to remove all of the resistors except for this one. So I'm going to go ahead and mount the camera in the tripod, and we'll go ahead and take care of that now. Alright, so I've gotten my CPU card ready to begin soldering, so let me go ahead and turn on my hot air. Alright, so the first thing we need to do, of course, is apply some flux to the areas where we'll be soldering. And like I said, we just have to remove all of these resistors except for that one. So I'm going to go ahead and put flux on all of those. So we will be removing all of these resistors, this one, and just leaving the one up here in place. Now, I'm not actually going to completely remove these resistors from the board. I'm just going to take them off one of the pads. That way I can keep the resistors on the board and can reinstall them if necessary without worrying about losing them. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get my hot air ready here and go ahead and remove all these resistors. Now, this is quite a thick board, so it will probably take a while to get hot enough to melt the solder. But let's see what we can do here. Alright, so there's one. As you can see, I just kind of moved it over one pad, so it's still attached to the board, but isn't actually doing anything anymore. So we'll do the same with this one right here. And lastly, this one right here. Alrighty, so as you can see, I have disconnected all of the necessary resistors. Let me go ahead and give you a close-up of that. So you can see I have disconnected all the resistors. You can see I have just moved them off to one pad right there. You can see I just took it from there and just moved it over. Did the same for this one and the same for this one. And just verified that they aren't making contact with anything they're not supposed to be. So with that, that should be a CPU V-core voltage set to 1.3 volts. So now we can finally begin the process of soldering on our new CPUs. But before we do that, we got to desolder the original CPUs. So I'm going to go ahead and clean up all the flux from over here, get this card on my board preheater, and we'll begin the process of removing both of these CPUs. Alrighty, so as you can see here, I've gotten the processor card onto the board preheater here. So the first thing we need to do before we actually begin heating anything is remove these little plastic covers off of the CPUs. So let me go ahead and see if I can't get that done now. And I'm just going to leave the little foam piece because that's not going to hurt anything. There we go. Alright, so now with that removed, I'm going to go ahead and apply some flux to the first processor here and go ahead and get it removed. Alright, the CPU is loose and ready to come off the board, so let's go ahead and pull it off. And this thing's not strong enough for that, apparently. I'm going to use some tweezers instead. Alright, and I'm not going to take the second one off yet. I'm just going to go ahead and get these pads cleaned up and actually solder the new processor on, and then I'm going to go ahead and do the second one the exact same way. So the first thing we need to do here is clean up the pads with the soldering iron. Alright, and with the pads nice and clean, the next thing we need to do is just remove all of the old flux from the board. Just like so. And I'm just using rubbing alcohol and a paper towel. Alright, so that looks to be clean enough. So the next thing we need to do is apply some new flux to the new chip. Now, luckily for me, the chips that I got already have solder balls on them. So it's as simple as just putting some flux on and then preparing it to go onto the board. So I'm going to go ahead and show you that process and resume the video in just a second. Alrighty, so in order to apply some new flux to the chip, we're just going to go ahead and take our new 7457 CPU right here and just apply some flux to the solder balls on the back. As you can see, it does already have solder balls pre-applied, which is very helpful. So I'll just apply a little bit of flux to that, like so. And then we'll grab it with a pair of tweezers and heat it over my board preheater. Grab it here. Turn on the board preheater. And that will just heat the chip up enough so the flux melts on it. And I can just completely cover every solder ball along the back of the chip. Alright, so as you can see there, the chip has been completely covered with flux. So now I'll just wipe that off just a tiny bit, and then it will be ready to solder onto the board. So I'm going to go ahead and get the chip wiped off and cleaned, and then proceed to solder it onto the board. Alright, so now that the chip is ready to go onto the board, the next thing I need to do is just apply a little bit of flux onto the board itself, onto the pads. And do that now. And then what you want to do is just take a paper towel and wipe off all the excess, just leaving a very thin layer of flux on the pads. So that looks good right there. So we will go ahead and take our new chip and place it onto the board. And it's very important that you get this pretty perfect. Alright, and that looks to be aligned just about good. So I'm going to go ahead and get this soldered onto the board. Alright, so that looks to be soldered pretty well, so we'll go ahead and let that cool down. And now all I have to do is just repeat the same process with the second chip. So I'm going to go ahead and get all that done one more time with the second chip, and then I'll go ahead and resume the video. Alrighty, so as you can see here, both CPUs are soldered on, and I've cleaned all the flux up off the board and off the processors. But one thing I noticed, and this was just after I completely finished, is that these are not exactly the same processors. So let me see if I can get the light on these better. So you can see this one is an SC7457 RX1267 LC, but the other one is an MC7457 VG1267 LC. So I'm not sure what the differences between these are, but they are rated for the same clock speed, which is 1.267 gigahertz, and I assume they'll work just fine together as they are, but I guess we will see. But now the last thing I need to do before I put this back in the machine is set the CPU clock speed. Now there's two ways to do that. One way to do it is to set the bus speed of the machine, which requires setting 2 resistors on this board and 2 resistors on the main logic board. However, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to leave it at the stock 133 megahertz front side bus speed, but just change the CPU clock multiplier. So thanks to that guide from the houseofmoth.com, we can actually use that to reference and figure out where to set the CPU clock multiplier resistors. And I believe they are located somewhere on the back of the board. I believe these are them right here, but I'm going to go ahead and check the guide just to be sure. So let's go ahead and get that open real quick and figure out exactly where the resistors are for the CPU clock multiplier and figure out what I need to set to achieve my desired clock speed. Now, I'm not exactly sure what clock speed I'm going to go for yet, but I think I'm just going to start with like 1.42 gigahertz or something around there, because I do only have the stock aluminum heatsink for the 867 megahertz processors, which may not be good enough to cool these when running at a super high clock speed. But we'll experiment and see. First, I'll start with 1.42 gigahertz or somewhere around there, and then we'll go from there. So I'm going to go ahead and get the guide open and see what I need to set. Alrighty, so I've gone ahead and opened up the guide here, and I've decided I'm just going to go ahead and jump all the way to 1.66 gigahertz. I think this thing should be able to handle it. So it looks like in order to do that, and I don't know if this is based on a 133 megahertz or 167 megahertz bus, but it looks like to do that, I need to change the resistors here. There's 2 sets. There's one set here, and then there's one set that I showed you before on the back of the board right there. So I'm just going to make these changes to these sets of resistors to set it at 1.66 gigahertz, and we'll go ahead and see how it runs. So hopefully it doesn't fry anything. I don't think it will. So yeah, let's go ahead and give it a shot. So I'm going to go ahead and get the camera put in the tripod, and then I'm going to set the resistors accordingly. Alright, so I've gotten the board ready to begin soldering these resistors, and like I said, we're going to be changing these right here. So let me go ahead and turn on the hot air, get that warming up, and then we'll get started. Alright, so of course we'll start by applying some flux to the board. Just like so. And like I said, we're going to have to do these on the top and the bottom. So for the top ones, it looks like we just need to have one resistor on R4 and one resistor on R8 and the other removed. So I'm going to go ahead and get the hot air out here. Go ahead and move this bottom one up to R4. Move R6 down to R8. And that one I'm just going to move out of the way so it doesn't make contact. Alright, so that should be the top set of resistors correctly changed. So let's go ahead and flip the board over and do the same with the bottom. See, and those resistors, make sure you can see them okay, are right down here, these resistors right there. So for these, it looks like we have to populate R3 and R7 and remove the third resistor just like on the top. So let's go ahead and apply some flux and change the resistors. So it's R3 and R7. Alright, so R3 and R7 are set there, and the third one disconnected. So in theory, that should be all we need to do. So I'm going to go ahead and show you a close-up here of what we've done. So as you can see here, I have set R7 and R3, I've populated those, and then R1 I just moved to one side there so it wasn't making any contact. And then on the front side of the board, I did basically the same thing. I just set, I set R4 and R8, and I just disconnected R2. So in theory, that should give us 1.66 gigahertz. But like I said, I don't know if that was set with the 133 megahertz or 167 megahertz front side bus speed. So it might be a little bit lower, but we will see and when we test it and if it works at all. So I'm going to go ahead and get this flux cleaned up, get the card put in the machine, and then we'll go ahead and give it a test. So I'll be right back. Alrighty, so as you can see here, I've gotten the CPU card reinstalled in the machine with, of course, the 7457 CPUs installed. Here's the heatsink right here. So I'm going to go ahead and put some thermal paste on these processors, put on the heatsink, and then we'll go ahead and get it tested. Alright, so as probably expected, running the CPUs at 1.66 gigahertz definitely did not work. But it wasn't actually the fault of the CPUs that were causing the issue. It's actually due to the L3 cache chips on this particular CPU card. Now, as I mentioned before, this is a 867 megahertz card, and as such, the L3 cache chips that were installed are slightly lower clock rated than the L3 cache chips on the faster boards like the 1.25 and 1.42 gigahertz boards. As such, the L3 cache on this particular board is only rated at 250 megahertz, whereas the L3 cache on the newer boards is actually rated for 300 megahertz. So unfortunately, that is our limiting factor on this specific board. And while I would attempt to upgrade the L3 cache, it is a lot of work because it is 4 BGA chips, and I don't actually have any extras on hand at the moment to install. So if I do end up finding some in the future, I might make another video and we'll actually get this CPU up to a decent clock. But after a bit of trial and error, I was able to get the machine to run stably at 1.25 gigahertz. So not optimal, but not terrible nonetheless. We are going from 867 megahertz to 1.25 gigahertz. And the 250 megahertz L3 cache seems to work just fine at that clock speed. I did also increase the system bus speed to 167 megahertz from its original 133 megahertz. So I assume that helped a little, but actually in the process, it stopped detecting one of my RAM modules for some reason. I think something was wrong with it to begin with, and running it faster at 167 megahertz just made it stop working entirely. So unfortunately, we'll only have 1 gig of RAM for the remainder of this test. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn the machine on, let it boot up into Mac OS X version 10.5 Leopard, and then we'll run the Geekbench test. So here we go. So I have switched monitors as well, as you can see. I actually switched locations and I did not bring the other monitor with me. So we've got this kind of crappy eMachines monitor for now, but it does work perfectly fine. So we'll go ahead and wait for the machine to boot up here. It does boot up quite fast now with the higher clock speed. Alright, so let's just go ahead and exit out of that, and we'll go ahead and open up Geekbench. Oh, and actually, before we do that, let's go ahead and check out about this Mac, and check out the system specifications. So as you can see here, it's got a dual 1.25 gigahertz now PowerPC G4 CPU. The same 1 megabyte of L3 cache is detected, and as I mentioned, one of the memory modules stopped working. I guess just due to that the bus speed change. But yes, as we can see here, the bus speed is now set to 167 megahertz, and it's detecting the CPU as a PowerPC 60 question mark, which is pretty normal for the CPUs that the Macs never actually shipped with. And as you can see, like I said, it's running at 1.25 gigahertz. So the last thing to check here is the memory, and I'll show you what happened there. As you can see, it's detecting the first module, but the second module isn't detected at all, and the machine won't actually boot with only that second module installed, even if you put it in the first slot. So it is definitely an issue with that specific memory module. So now what we're going to go ahead and do is run Geekbench on the machine. As you can see here, it detects the CPU now as a PowerPC G4 7447 or 7457. Obviously we have a 7457 CPU installed, or two of them for that matter. So now let's just go ahead and run the benchmarks. So this will take quite some time to complete, so I'm going to go ahead and pause the video here and resume it once the benchmark has completed. Alright, so as you can see here, the benchmark was completed successfully. You can see that it achieved a score of 1062. And if we go ahead and open our original result here with the original CPUs, you can see that it originally made a 667. So a pretty decent improvement, even though we weren't able to get exactly the performance that we intended to out of it. But as you can see here, we've got the processor frequency at 1.25 with a 167 megahertz bus speed. And then of course that 512K of L2 cache, which is part of the 7457 CPUs. So if we go ahead and take a look at the original specifications, you can see that the 7455 that it had, or the two that it had, only had 256K of L2 cache, and we're running at 867 megahertz, obviously. So overall, it was a pretty good result. We can go ahead and look at the other results here and see what the differences look like. So yeah, overall, quite an increase in the score. Like I said, not a huge increase like I had hoped if we were able to run it at 1.42 or 1.5 gigahertz, or maybe even more than that. But nonetheless, I'd still think this was a worthwhile upgrade for this specific machine, especially originally being an 867 megahertz model. So let's go down here, see what the floating point performance was. Not bad. And the memory score is probably, yeah, even that's better, even though we lost one memory module. That's probably down to the system bus speed change more than anything. So with that, that's been the upgrade of this PowerMac G4 MDD to dual 1.25 gigahertz PowerPC 7457 CPUs. Hope you enjoyed this video.